The information in this presentation is for educational and informational purposes only, and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical or mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen in this video. In 1955, at the absolute peak, over 500,000 Americans were living inside state-run psychiatric hospitals. 560,000 people. That's more than the entire current population of Sacramento, California, locked away in institutions. Today, that number is less than 40,000, a staggering 93% reduction. This wasn't a gradual decline. It was a deliberate, nationwide dismantling, an emptying out. It was the single greatest social experiment in modern American history, and you are living inside that experiment right now. So, the question is, where did all those people go? If you've ever walked through a major American city and wondered about the homelessness crisis, if you've seen news reports about overflowing emergency rooms, if you've been shocked to learn that the largest mental health care providers in the country are now county jails like Cook County in Chicago or Rikers Island in New York, then you have seen the fallout from that decision. The ghosts of those old hospitals haunt our streets, our ERs, and our prisons. And to understand how we got here, to truly grasp the monumental challenge we face today, we have to go back. We have to understand what we were running from. For a century, the American solution to severe mental illness was the asylum. They were architectural marvels, often the largest and most expensive buildings in a state. Sprawling campuses with Gothic towers, manicured lawns, and names that sounded serene. Fairview, Pleasant Grove, Riverview. They were designed as self-contained cities on a hill, complete with their own farms, power plants, and chapels. The idea, born from a 19th century belief in moral treatment, was to provide a peaceful refuge, a sanctuary where the mentally ill could heal, far from the stresses of industrial society. It was a noble, optimistic vision, but by the mid-20th century, that vision had rotted from the inside out. In this deep dive, we are going to connect the dots. We're going to uncover the three seismic forces that collided to bring this entire system crashing down. A revolution in medicine, a revolution in law, and a revolution in public opinion. By the end of this journey, you will understand not just what happened but why it happened. You'll see the unintended consequences of well-meaning reforms and understand why the common refrain of "just bring back the asylums" is a tragically simplistic answer to a profoundly complex problem. This is the story of how America tried to solve one crisis and, in the process, created another. It all started with a change in what we saw. For decades, the asylum was out of sight, out of mind. A place where families sent their difficult relatives, often with a mix of shame and relief. What happened behind those locked doors was a mystery. But in the 1940s and 50s, a few brave journalists and reformers started to get inside. And what they found was not a sanctuary, but a snake pit. The term comes from the title of a groundbreaking 1946 novel, and later a film, that gave the American public its first horrifying glimpse into the reality of these institutions. The picture it painted was one of human warehousing on an industrial scale. The noble idea of a peaceful refuge had been crushed under the weight of economic depression and 2 world wars. State funding was slashed. Staffing levels plummeted. A hospital designed for 1,500 patients might be crammed with 6,000. One psychiatrist might be responsible for thousands of individuals. The result was chaos. Patients were left in dirty clothes, sleeping on floors in hallways reeking of urine and disinfectant. The treatments were often just methods of control, designed to make a desperate and underpaid staff's job easier. Imagine being subjected to insulin coma therapy, where you're intentionally given an overdose of insulin to induce a seizure and a coma, a risky procedure done day after day. Or electroshock therapy, administered without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, the raw voltage causing convulsions so violent they could break bones. And then there was the most infamous procedure of all, the lobotomy. An ice pick-like instrument was hammered through the bone of the eye socket into the brain, severing connections in the frontal lobe. It was a cheap 10-minute procedure that could turn a volatile patient into a placid, empty shell. It won its inventor a Nobel Prize, and it was performed on an estimated 50,000 Americans. This wasn't healing. This was management. This was control. And as these stories, these pictures, these horrifying accounts began leaking out into the mainstream, a profound sense of national shame began to grow. Life magazine published a shocking exposé titled Bedlam 1946, with photographs of naked men huddled together in a barren cell. Conscientious objectors from World War II, who chose to serve as orderlies in these hospitals instead of fighting, came back with stories of abuse and neglect that were impossible to ignore. The public started to realize that these beautiful, imposing buildings on the hill were hiding a national horror. They weren't hospitals, they were prisons for the sick. The moral outrage was palpable. The consensus was clear. Something had to change. This system was broken, it was cruel, and it had to be torn down. But moral outrage alone doesn't dismantle a nationwide, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure. You can't just unlock the doors and send hundreds of thousands of seriously ill people out into the world. You need an alternative. You need a new plan. And just as this public fury was reaching its peak, a scientific breakthrough occurred in a lab in France that promised to be just that. It was a pill. A so-called miracle drug that advocates claimed could calm the storms of psychosis, quiet the voices, and ultimately, unlock the doors of the asylum from the inside. That pill was called chlorpromazine. In the United States, it would be given a name that would become synonymous with a revolution in psychiatry, Thorazine. And the story of its discovery is one of pure scientific serendipity. It wasn't designed to treat psychosis. It wasn't even created for the brain. It was developed by a French pharmaceutical company as a powerful antihistamine, a compound intended to reduce surgical shock and sedate patients before anesthesia. But during those preoperative trials, a French surgeon named Henri Labret noticed something peculiar. His patients weren't just calm, they were detached, uninterested in their own impending surgery. A profound, serene indifference had settled over them. Labret had a thought, a wild leap of intuition. He wondered, if this drug could create such a powerful detachment from physical stress, what could it do for someone detached from reality itself? He convinced his colleagues to try it on a patient with severe mania, a man who had been cycling through the hospital's most aggressive treatments for months with no success. The results were immediate and staggering. Within a day, the patient's manic storm subsided. He was calm, coherent, and for the first time in a long time reachable. Word spread like wildfire through the psychiatric community. It was hailed as a chemical lobotomy, but without the scalpel, without the irreversible destruction of brain tissue. Unlike barbiturates or other sedatives that simply knocked patients unconscious, Thorazine seemed to target the psychosis itself. It quieted the terrifying hallucinations. It silenced the menacing voices. It untangled the paranoid delusions. For doctors who had spent their entire careers armed with little more than restraints and ice baths, this was the equivalent of being handed a magic wand. The drug made its way across the Atlantic to the pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline & French. They saw the potential immediately, not just as a treatment but as a product that could change the world and make a fortune. They launched one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in medical history. They pitched Thorazine not just to psychiatrists but to general practitioners, to nursing homes, to prisons. They sold it as a cure for everything from anxiety and alcoholism to senility and severe hiccups. But its star role was always as the key that would empty the asylums. Sales representatives, armed with glossy brochures and promising studies, fanned out across the country, visiting the very state hospitals that were overflowing with patients. Their message was simple and incredibly seductive. The era of the institution is over. This message landed on fertile ground. By the mid-1950s, America had fallen out of love with its asylums. The optimistic vision of moral treatment had decayed into a grim reality of custodial care. A series of horrifying exposés like Albert Deutsch's 1948 book, The Shame of the States, had revealed the brutal, overcrowded, and squalid conditions inside. These places were no longer seen as havens for healing, but as snake pits, human warehouses where society's unwanted were left to rot. The public was horrified, and state governments were groaning under the immense financial burden of maintaining these colossal institutions. The annual cost was running into the billions, and the patient population was still climbing, peaking at over 550,000 people in 1955. Politicians, both liberal and conservative, saw an opportunity. For liberals, closing the asylums was a moral crusade, a righteous fight for civil rights against unjust confinement. For conservatives, it was a fiscal dream come true, a chance to slash state budgets by shutting down the single most expensive item on the ledger. Thorazine, and the wave of similar antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs that followed, provided the perfect justification for both sides. It was the ultimate political lubricant. The problem of mental illness, it seemed, could now be solved with a prescription pad and a fraction of the budget. This convergence of scientific breakthrough, pharmaceutical marketing, public outrage, and political expediency gave birth to a movement that would define the next half-century of mental health care: deinstitutionalization. The philosophy was, on its face, profoundly humane and logical. Why should a person with a manageable illness be locked away for life, isolated from family and community? The new model was community-based care. The plan was to release patients from the massive state hospitals and build a nationwide network of smaller, local mental health centers. In these centers, former patients could live in their own communities, hold jobs, maintain relationships, and receive outpatient care. A weekly therapy session, a monthly check-in for their medication. It was a beautiful utopian vision, a vision of freedom, dignity, and recovery. And it was a vision that found its most powerful champion in the White House. President John F. Kennedy had a deeply personal connection to the issue. His own sister, Rosemary, had been subjected to a prefrontal lobotomy in 1941 that had left her permanently incapacitated and institutionalized. He had seen the failures of the old system firsthand. In a landmark address to Congress in 1963, he became the first and only president to make mental health a major national priority. He spoke with a passion born from family tragedy, calling for a bold new approach. He said, "We must seek out the causes of mental illness and mental retardation and eradicate them. It is a national problem, and it must be a national responsibility." Later that year, he signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. This legislation provided federal funding to build the very network of community centers that would form the backbone of the new system. It was the point of no return. The law, combined with the power of the new medications, set in motion a mass exodus from the state hospitals unlike anything the world had ever seen. The great, Gothic fortresses of the asylum era were finally being emptied. The doors were being thrown open. Felt like a victory, a triumph of science and compassion over ignorance and cruelty. The number of patients in state hospitals began to plummet, year after year. From over 500,000 in the 1950s, the numbers would fall by 75, 80, eventually over 90%. But as the drugs flowed out, and the patients walked free, a disturbing new reality began to emerge. The miracle drugs were not a cure. They were a chemical control, and they came with a heavy price. Patients began to develop debilitating side effects: a permanent, uncontrollable tremor, a shuffling zombie-like gait that became known as the Thorazine shuffle, and most terrifying of all, a grotesque and often irreversible condition called tardive dyskinesia, which caused involuntary writhing movements of the face, tongue, and limbs. The promise of the pill was beginning to tarnish, and the beautiful vision of a robust, nationwide network of community care centers, the safe landing promise to all those leaving the hospitals, was proving to be far more of a mirage than a reality. The asylums were being closed, but the crucial question nobody seemed to have a good answer for was this: where were all these people supposed to go? The answer for hundreds of thousands of people was nowhere. They went from a locked ward to a bus station, often with little more than a small supply of medication and a few dollars in their pocket. They were told to find the local community mental health center, the cornerstone of this new enlightened era. But when they arrived, they didn't find the comprehensive wraparound care they were promised. They found a small office, a handful of overworked staff, and a waiting list that stretched for months. The grand vision of President Kennedy, of a network of 1,000 vibrant community centers, was a dream deferred, and ultimately a dream denied. The Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 was a landmark piece of legislation, but it had a fatal flaw. It was built on a foundation of wishful thinking. The plan was for the federal government to provide the initial funding to get these centers off the ground, and then for states and local communities to take over the long-term financial responsibility. But that's not what happened. States, eager to slash their own budgets by closing the massive, expensive state hospitals, saw deinstitutionalization as a golden opportunity to shift the cost of care onto the federal government. They closed the asylums with alarming speed, but they never fully invested in the community-based alternatives. Federal funding, which was never enough to begin with, was designed to decrease over time. And as the political wind shifted in the 1970s and 80s, with budget cuts and a move towards fiscal conservatism, that funding all but evaporated. The result was a ghost system. On paper, there was a safety net. In reality, there were gaping holes, and tens of thousands of the most vulnerable people in society were falling right through them. For the individuals themselves, this was a catastrophe. Imagine being institutionalized for 10, 20, even 30 years. The world outside the hospital walls is alien. You have no recent work history, no credit, no references. Your family ties may have been severed long ago. You're trying to manage a complex psychiatric condition, but now you're also responsible for finding housing, buying food, navigating public transportation, and managing your own medication. A task that is incredibly difficult even in the best of circumstances. Without consistent support, many began to decompensate. They stopped taking their medication because of the side effects, or because they simply couldn't afford the refills. They lost their spot in a rundown boarding house. They started self-medicating with drugs or alcohol to quiet the voices or numb the despair, leading to a whole new set of problems. This gave rise to a phenomenon that professionals grimly refer to as the revolving door. A person would have a crisis on the street, the police would be called, and they'd be taken to a hospital emergency room. They would be stabilized over a few days in a short-term psychiatric unit, then discharged right back to the same unsupported environment that caused the crisis in the first place. A few weeks or months later, the cycle would repeat. In out, in out. It was a system that managed crises but offered no path to recovery. But there was another door opening for this population, a much heavier, much colder one. As communities struggled to cope with a growing number of visibly disturbed individuals on their streets, the response wasn't to build more clinics. It was to enforce the law. Behaviors that might have once been seen as symptoms of an illness, talking to oneself, sleeping in a park, petty shoplifting for food, were now viewed as criminal offenses. The police, with little to no training in mental health, became the frontline responders. And when they arrived on the scene, they had two choices: the hospital or jail. With hospital beds disappearing, the choice was often made for them. This was the beginning of a seismic shift, a process that sociologists call transinstitutionalization. It sounds complicated, but the idea is simple and devastating. We didn't end the practice of institutionalizing the mentally ill. We just changed the institution. We moved them from hospitals to prisons. The numbers are staggering, and they tell a story of breathtaking failure. In the mid-1950s, at the peak of the asylum era, there were nearly 600,000 Americans in public psychiatric hospitals. By the early 2000s, that number had plummeted to around 50,000. But over that same period, the number of people with serious mental illness in our jails and prisons exploded. Today, the Los Angeles County Jail, Chicago's Cook County Jail, and New York's Rikers Island are, by population, the three largest mental health facilities in the entire United States. They hold more mentally ill individuals than any hospital in the country. Sheriffs and corrections officers have become the nation's de facto mental health care providers, a job they were never trained for and never wanted. This criminalization of mental illness created a downward spiral from which it is nearly impossible to escape. An arrest, even for a minor offense, creates a criminal record, making it even harder to find a job or secure housing. Inside jail, these individuals are often targets of violence. Their symptoms can worsen dramatically in the chaotic, high-stress environment. They are often placed in solitary confinement for their own protection, or because they can't follow the rigid rules of prison life, a practice that is now widely recognized as a form of psychological torture. They get trapped in a cycle not just of hospitalization but of incarceration. And so, the great liberation of deinstitutionalization led directly to the great tragedy of modern homelessness and mass incarceration. By the 1980s, the results were visible on the streets of every major American city. The homeless population, which had been relatively small and stable for decades, suddenly swelled. And within this new population was a large and highly visible subgroup: people suffering from untreated schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other severe psychiatric conditions. They were the ghosts of the asylums, living specters of a policy that had been born from noble intentions, but had collapsed into catastrophic neglect. The freedom they were promised turned out to be the freedom to be cold, the freedom to be hungry, and the freedom to be afraid. They were released from the hospital, but they were never welcomed into the community. They were abandoned. The system hadn't just failed to catch them, it had pushed them over the edge. The question was no longer where they would go, but what, if anything, could be done to pull them back. As the crisis deepened and the consequences became too obvious to ignore, a new generation of doctors, advocates, and families began to ask a radical question. Had we gone too far? The answer, which came not from politicians or hospital administrators, but from the rain-soaked streets and crowded jails of America's cities, was a deafening, heartbreaking yes. A generation had been liberated from the asylum, only to be imprisoned by a new set of walls. The walls of public indifference, of fractured families, of their own unmedicated minds. The great project of deinstitutionalization had been built on a promise of 1,000 community mental health centers, a robust safety net of outpatient care, therapy, and support. But the promise was a ghost. The funding never fully materialized. The centers that did open were often understaffed, overwhelmed, and ill-equipped to handle the profound needs of those with severe, persistent mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. For the patients, the new reality was a nightmare. They were discharged with a bus ticket, a small supply of medication, and a referral to a community center that might not exist. They became the faces of a new urban crisis. They were the men shouting at unseen demons on the sidewalk, the women huddled in library doorways for warmth, the lost souls cycling in and out of emergency rooms. This became known as the revolving door syndrome. A person in crisis would be picked up, briefly stabilized in a hospital, and then discharged back to the same unsupported environment that caused the crisis in the first place. The cycle would repeat, again and again, each rotation chipping away a little more of their humanity, their hope, their connection to reality. Jails and prisons by default became the new asylums. Sheriffs and police officers with no medical training became the frontline mental health care workers. By the early 1980s, the Los Angeles County Jail was considered the largest mental institution in the country. The promise of freedom had, for many, become the freedom to be homeless, the freedom to be incarcerated, the freedom to be sick. But there was another group of victims in this tragedy, a silent, forgotten army: the families. They were the ones who had been told that these new policies, these new drugs, would be a miracle. They watched their sons, daughters, husbands, and wives descend into the maelstrom of psychosis, and they were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The system that had promised to help now offered them nothing but platitudes and closed doors. They were told their loved one had a right to be ill, a right to refuse treatment, even when that refusal was a direct symptom of the illness itself. Imagine the torment. Watching someone you love, someone whose mind is betraying them, refuse the very help that could save them, and being legally powerless to intervene. They couldn't force them to take medication. They couldn't have them committed unless they posed an imminent danger to themselves or others. A standard so high it often meant waiting for a tragedy to happen before anything could be done. Families were exhausted, bankrupted, and ostracized. They were blamed by a society that didn't understand, and they were dismissed by a medical system that often viewed them as part of the problem. It was in this crucible of desperation and anger that a new movement was born. It didn't start in a government building or a university lecture hall. It started in kitchens, in living rooms, in whispered phone calls between strangers who shared the same unspeakable grief. In 1979, in Madison, Wisconsin, two of these strangers, Harriet Shetler and Beverly Young, two mothers of adult sons with schizophrenia, organized a meeting. They thought maybe a few dozen people would show up. Over 250 parents and family members crowded into that room, each one carrying the same burden of fear and isolation. In that moment, they realized they were not alone. And in that moment, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, was born. This was a revolution. For the first time, families were organizing not as quiet caregivers, but as a powerful national advocacy force. Their message was simple and radical. Severe mental illness is not a character flaw. It is not the result of bad parenting. It is a brain disease, a biological medical condition that requires medical treatment just like diabetes or heart disease. They rejected the psychoanalytic theories that had blamed schizophrenic mothers for their children's illness. They demanded research, they demanded better treatments, and they demanded a seat at the policymaking table. They were fighting against a system that seemed to prioritize a distorted notion of civil liberties over the fundamental human right to be well. One of the key concepts they brought into the public debate was something called anosognosia. It's a neurological term, a symptom of brain damage that leaves a person physically unable to recognize their own illness. A stroke victim might be paralyzed on one side but insist they are fine. For many with severe mental illness, anosognosia means they genuinely do not believe they are sick. Their delusions and hallucinations are, to them, reality. So when they refuse medication, it isn't a rational choice. It's a symptom of the disease itself. NAMI and other family advocates argued that forcing someone to live with untreated psychosis, under the banner of protecting their right to choose, was not freedom. It was abandonment. It was cruel. They began to lobby state by state to change the civil commitment laws. They argued for a standard that didn't require waiting for violence, but that allowed for intervention when a person was gravely disabled and unable to care for themselves due to their mental illness. This created a deep and bitter divide, one that still exists today. On one side were the family advocates and a growing number of psychiatrists who saw the suffering firsthand and believed that involuntary treatment could be a compassionate, life-saving act. On the other side were the civil liberties advocates and former patients who had experienced the horrors of the old asylums. They saw any attempt to make commitment easier as a terrifying step back toward a time of coercion and abuse. They argued that a person's bodily autonomy was paramount, even if their choices seemed self-destructive. It was a clash of two deeply held valid principles: the right to be safe and healthy versus the right to be free. The tragedy was that for thousands of people living on the streets, the system had denied them both. The pendulum, which had swung so far and so fast away from the institution, had begun ever so slowly to swing back. The naive optimism of the 1960s was gone, replaced by the grim realities of the 1980s. The conversation was changing. The term brain disease started to replace mental disorder in the public lexicon. The federal government, spurred by this new wave of advocacy, began to pour more money into neuroscience research, seeking to understand the biological roots of these devastating illnesses. The simplistic villain of the story was no longer the asylum itself, but the vacuum it had left behind. The nation was starting to acknowledge the profound systemic failure that had occurred. But acknowledging a problem and solving it are two very different things. As the decade wore on, a new generation of psychiatric drugs would appear, promising another revolution, and the debate over force, freedom, and the very nature of care would intensify, leading to new models of treatment and new, even more complex ethical battlegrounds. The ghosts of the asylum had been released, but they were far from gone. They were simply haunting a new, much larger, and much more visible house: America itself. The grand emptying of the asylums was meant to be a liberation, an exodus from the shadows of the institution into the sunlight of the community. President John F. Kennedy in 1963 called for a bold new approach, envisioning a network of local community mental health centers that would replace the vast, isolated state hospitals. It was a beautiful, compassionate idea, born from an era of civil rights and social optimism. The plan was to dismantle the old, cruel machinery of confinement and build something better in its place. A system where people could receive treatment while still living at home, holding jobs, and being part of the fabric of society. The law he signed, the Community Mental Health Act, was supposed to be the blueprint for this new world. It promised federal funding to build hundreds of these centers across the nation. The asylum doors would swing open, and a robust, well-funded safety net would be there to catch everyone. That was the promise. The reality was a catastrophic failure of execution, a civic betrayal on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The states, which had been groaning under the immense financial weight of the asylum system for decades, saw an opportunity. They heard the part about closing the hospitals loud and clear. It was a chance to slash their budgets and offload a century-old problem. So they began the process of deinstitutionalization with alarming speed. Between the mid-1950s and the mid-1990s, the number of patients in state mental hospitals plummeted by over 90%, from more than 500,000 people to fewer than 70,000. The doors were unlocked, the wards were emptied, and the sprawling campuses were sold off to developers. But what about the other half of the promise? The community centers? The safety net? It never fully materialized. The federal funding that Kennedy envisioned was a fraction of what was needed. It was seed money intended to get the centers started, with the expectation that states and local governments would pick up the rest of the tab. But they didn't. As the Vietnam War escalated and the economy soured in the 1970s, public appetite for new social spending dried up. Then, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration fundamentally altered the funding structure, shifting from direct federal support for the centers to block grants given to states. This gave states more discretion on how to spend the money, and all too often, the funds intended for mental health were diverted to other priorities. It was a cruel bait and switch. The states had been let off the hook for funding the old asylums, and now they were largely let off the hook for funding the new community centers too. The result was a vacuum. Hundreds of thousands of people with serious, chronic mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression were discharged into a world utterly unprepared for them. They were given, perhaps, a bus ticket, a small supply of medication, and a referral to a community center that was understaffed, underfunded, or in many cases didn't even exist yet. They were released into the community, but the community had no idea what to do with them. Families, who were never consulted, were suddenly expected to become round-the-clock caregivers for relatives with complex conditions, with no training, no support, and no resources. Many couldn't cope. The social bonds of these individuals, already frayed by years of institutionalization, completely dissolved, and so they ended up on the streets. The explosion of visible, chronic homelessness that began in the late 1970s and became a defining feature of American cities in the 80s is not a coincidence. It is a direct, undeniable consequence of failed deinstitutionalization. Before this period, the stereotypical image of a homeless person was often an older, alcoholic man in a flophouse on Skid Row. Suddenly, the demographics changed. Now you saw younger people and a significant number of women, many of whom were clearly psychotic, muttering to themselves, disorganized and terrified. They were the ghosts of the asylum, made flesh and bone, now haunting our sidewalks and parks. But the streets weren't the only place they ended up. An even more sinister destination awaited them: the American prison system. As these individuals, unmedicated and unsupported, began to decompensate, their symptoms were reinterpreted by society. What a psychiatrist would recognize as psychosis, a police officer saw as disorderly conduct. What a doctor would see as a manic episode, a judge saw as resisting arrest. Minor offenses, trespassing to find shelter, petty theft to find food, public nuisance, led to arrests. And once they were in the criminal justice system, they were trapped. This phenomenon has a name: transinstitutionalization. It's the illusion of freedom. We didn't deinstitutionalize people. We simply transferred them from one institution, the mental hospital, to another, the jail or prison. The numbers are staggering and shameful. Today, the three largest mental health providers in the United States are not hospitals. They are the Cook County Jail in Chicago, the Los Angeles County Jail, and Rikers Island in New York City. There are more than 3 times as many people with serious mental illness in our jails and prisons than in our hospitals. Sheriffs and corrections officers have become the nation's frontline mental health workers, a job they never signed up for and are not equipped to do. The concrete cell has replaced the padded room. Solitary confinement has replaced seclusion. The problem was not solved, it was criminalized. We closed the asylums, but we built the architecture of neglect right back up again, just with different names on the buildings. This new reality was cemented by a paradox in the law. The same civil rights movement that correctly fought against the abuses of forced institutionalization also created legal standards that made it incredibly difficult to intervene. New laws, like California's landmark Lanterman-Patrice Short Act of 1967, were designed to protect a person's right to refuse treatment. They established a very high bar for involuntary commitment. A person had to be in imminent danger to themselves, an imminent danger to others, or gravely disabled, meaning they couldn't provide for their own basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter. While noble in its intent to prevent people from being locked away indefinitely for simply being eccentric, it created a tragic catch-22. A family could watch their loved one descend into paranoid psychosis, refusing help, but unless that person made an explicit threat or was found literally starving on the street, there was nothing anyone could do. The system was now designed to wait for the absolute worst-case scenario. You had to wait for the tragedy to happen before you were legally allowed to prevent it. The dream of community care had died. In its place was a nightmare of scattered, inadequate services, overwhelmed families, and an unforgiving legal system. The Great Liberation had become a great abandonment. The people we promised to help were now more vulnerable than ever, lost in a cycle of homelessness, hospitalization, and incarceration. This revolving door spun faster and faster, chewing up lives and spitting them out onto the cold pavement of public indifference. The nation had confronted the sins of the asylum, but in its haste to tear them down, it had created a new, more diffuse, and in many ways more cruel form of human misery. And that misery had a face. It had a name. But for most of America in the late 1970s and 1980s, it was just part of the urban landscape. It was the woman on the corner, wrapped in layers of filthy coats in the middle of July, arguing with phantoms. It was the man sleeping on a subway grate, his worldly possessions stuffed into a garbage bag. It was the vacant stare of someone lost in a world no one else could see. These were the ghosts of the asylums, haunting the very streets they were meant to be freed into. The Great Deinstitutionalization, born from a noble dream of civil rights and community care, had devolved into a catastrophic failure of public policy. The core of the problem was a broken promise. The Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963, the very legislation that unlocked the hospital doors, was built on a crucial second step: the creation of a nationwide network of local clinics. These centers were supposed to be the safety net, providing therapy, medication, and support to catch the people released from state hospitals. But that net was never fully woven. The initial federal funding was meant to be seed money, with states and local communities expected to pick up the cost over time. But then the political winds shifted. The Vietnam War consumed the national budget. The economic stagflation of the 1970s squeezed state and local coffers dry. The grand vision for 1,000 community health centers withered on the vine. Only about half of the planned centers were ever built, and those that were often chronically underfunded and overwhelmed. They were simply not equipped to handle the most severe cases, the very people who were now being discharged in droves. So where did these people go? They went nowhere. They were released with a bus ticket, a small supply of medication, and a referral to a community center that might not exist or couldn't help them. They ended up in rundown boarding houses, in homeless shelters, or most often on the streets. The term revolving door became a grim staple of the American lexicon. A person would have a psychotic break, get picked up by police, and be taken to a hospital for a short-term stay, just long enough to be stabilized with medication. Then they'd be discharged back to the same unsupported environment, stop taking their medication, and the cycle would begin all over again. It was a cruel, expensive, and utterly ineffective way to manage a health crisis. But the streets and emergency rooms were only one destination. As the 1980s dawned, a new institution was quietly, and then not so quietly, rising to take the place of the old asylum. It was an institution America was already very good at building and funding: the prison. This wasn't a conscious policy decision, but the inevitable result of a vacuum. When you take a large population of people with complex behavioral and cognitive challenges and remove their primary source of care, however flawed, they don't just disappear. Their symptoms, paranoia, delusions, erratic behavior, often lead to conflict. They get arrested for vagrancy, for trespassing because they were sleeping in a storefront, for petty theft because they were hungry, or for disorderly conduct because they were having a public psychotic episode. Police officers, never trained to be social workers or psychiatric nurses, became the de facto first responders for mental health crises. Many developed a practice known as the mercy booking, arresting a mentally ill person for a minor offense simply to get them off the cold streets and into a warm cell for the night, knowing it was the only form of shelter available. The result was a phenomenon sociologists call transinstitutionalization. The problem wasn't solved. The people were just moved from one type of institution, the hospital, to another, the jail. The numbers tell a staggering story. In 1955, at the peak of the asylum era, there were over 500,000 Americans in public psychiatric hospitals. By the early 2000s, that number had plummeted to around 50,000. Over that same period, the number of incarcerated Americans exploded. And a massive proportion of those inmates were, and are, people with serious mental illness. A 2006 Justice Department study found that more than half of all prison and jail inmates had a mental health problem. Today, the Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island in New York, and the Cook County Jail in Chicago are consistently ranked as the 3 largest de facto mental health facilities in the entire United States. They hold more mentally ill individuals than any remaining hospital. Think about that for a moment. The largest mental health providers in the country are not hospitals designed for healing, but prisons designed for punishment. They are staffed not by doctors and therapists, but by correctional officers who are often ill-equipped to handle the complexities of psychosis or severe depression. In this environment, treatment is an afterthought if it exists at all. Solitary confinement, a practice known to be psychologically devastating for even the healthiest minds, is often used to manage inmates whose psychotic symptoms are mistaken for insubordination. The result is a humanitarian crisis hidden behind bars. People who need care are instead getting traumatized, their conditions worsening in the chaos and violence of prison life. Upon release, they are more ill, more isolated, and more likely to reoffend, creating a feedback loop of misery and incarceration. This criminalization of mental illness was further accelerated by the political climate of the 1980s. The Reagan administration's Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 fundamentally altered federal funding for social services. It replaced dedicated funding for community mental health centers with block grants to the states, giving them more discretion on how to spend the money. Facing their own budget crises, many states diverted those funds away from mental health services and towards other priorities. It was the final nail in the coffin for the dream of comprehensive community care. At the same time, a tough-on-crime political rhetoric was sweeping the nation. leading to stricter sentencing laws and a massive expansion of the prison system. The two trends converged with devastating consequences. We defunded the hospitals and clinics, and then we built more prisons to house the people who had nowhere else to go. On a social level, another obstacle emerged: fear. The same public that had been horrified by the exposé of asylum conditions was now fearful of the people who had been released. The Not in My Backyard, or NIMBY movement, became a powerful force. Communities that supported the idea of local mental health care in theory fought viciously against the opening of a group home or a clinic in their own neighborhood. Stigma, fueled by sensationalized media portrayals of violence committed by the mentally ill, created invisible walls far more effective than the brick and mortar of the old asylums. People wanted the problem to be solved, but they wanted it solved somewhere else, out of sight and out of mind. The Great Liberation had become the Great Abandonment. The hospital walls had been torn down, only to be replaced by the invisible, but far more impenetrable, walls of the prison cell and the city sidewalk. This new reality created a brutal and efficient pipeline, funneling the most vulnerable from the streets directly into the criminal justice system. By the turn of the 21st century, the three largest mental health providers in the United States were not hospitals. They were jails: Los Angeles County, Cook County in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York. A study by the Treatment Advocacy Center found that there were 10 times more people with serious mental illness in prisons and jails than in state psychiatric hospitals. This wasn't a policy. No one sat in a room and designed this outcome. It was a catastrophic system failure, a vacuum created by the closure of one institution that was inevitably filled by another. Police officers, never trained to be social workers or psychiatric nurses, became the de facto first responders for mental health crises. When a person experiencing a psychotic break was found shouting on a street corner or trespassing in a storefront, the call went to 911. With no community crisis centers to take them to, and with hospital beds almost non-existent, the options for law enforcement were stark. Leave the person on the street or arrest them. Often an arrest for a minor offense, disorderly conduct, loitering, petty theft, was seen as the most humane option. At least in jail they would have a roof over their head. At least they would be safe. But they weren't safe, and it wasn't humane. A county jail is designed for punishment and containment, not for healing and therapy. The chaotic, loud, and violent environment of a jail is the precise opposite of the calm, structured setting required for psychiatric stabilization. Staff are trained as corrections officers, not mental health professionals. Instead of de-escalation, they're trained in control and restraint. A person suffering from paranoia and delusions isn't met with compassion. They're seen as a non-compliant inmate, a security risk. The primary form of treatment for a disruptive, mentally ill inmate often became solitary confinement. Locked in a small concrete cell for 23 hours a day, their psychosis would worsen, their paranoia would intensify, and their connection to reality would fray even further. They would be released back to the streets, often without medication and with no follow-up plan, sicker than when they went in. Their criminal record now made it even harder to find housing or a job. It was a revolving door spinning faster and faster from the street to the jail cell and back to the street again. The system wasn't just failing to treat them. It was actively making them worse. It was criminalizing the symptoms of a disease. For those who managed to avoid the criminal justice system, the Great Liberation often meant a different kind of prison, the prison of the streets. The promise of deinstitutionalization was that patients would be supported by a robust network of community mental health centers. But that network was never fully built. The funding that was supposed to follow the patients out of the hospitals never fully materialized. It was diverted, cut, or simply deemed insufficient for the sheer scale of the need. So, people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression were discharged with a bottle of pills and a bus ticket to a town they didn't know, with no one to ensure they took their medication, no one to help them navigate the bureaucracy of social services, and no safety net to catch them when they fell. And they fell. Their symptoms, disorganized thinking, paranoia, and inability to concentrate, made it nearly impossible to hold down a job, manage finances, or maintain a lease. They became homeless. Tent cities and shelter beds became the new asylums, but without walls, without doctors, and without any pretense of treatment. This led to a question that baffled the public for decades. If help is available, why don't they just get it? Why don't they take their medication? Why won't they go to a shelter? The answer is one of the most misunderstood and tragic aspects of severe mental illness, a neurological symptom called anosognosia. It's not denial, Denial is a psychological defense mechanism where a person resists an unpleasant truth. Anosognosia is a physical problem, a deficit in the frontal lobe of the brain, the very part responsible for insight and self-awareness. It's a symptom of the illness itself that makes the person biologically incapable of understanding that they are ill. Imagine waking up and everyone you know insists you have a third arm growing out of your back. You can't see it. You can't feel it. As far as your brain is concerned, it doesn't exist. Now imagine they want to perform a major, life-altering surgery to remove this arm you know you don't have. You would resist. You would think they were the ones who were crazy. That is the reality for up to 50% of individuals with schizophrenia and 40% with bipolar disorder. They don't believe they are sick. So when a doctor offers them medication, they see it as an attempt to poison or control them. When a family member begs them to get help, they hear it as an attack. They aren't being stubborn or defiant. Their brain is lying to them. And our entire post-deinstitutionalization system was built on the flawed premise of voluntary treatment. It was a system designed for people who could recognize their illness and willingly seek care. It completely failed the very sickest, the ones who couldn't. This created an impossible paradox. The law, rightly concerned with protecting civil liberties, made it incredibly difficult to hospitalize someone against their will. You had to prove they were in imminent danger to themselves or others. But what about the person slowly starving to death on a park bench because their paranoia tells them all the food is poisoned? They aren't in imminent danger in the eyes of the law, not yet. What about the woman freezing on a street grate in the middle of winter, refusing shelter because the voices tell her the building is on fire? The system, in its effort to protect her liberty, was protecting her right to die slowly from her untreated illness. The public's compassion began to curdle into frustration. The visible consequences of this systemic failure were on every city street. The media was filled with stories of tragic, violent encounters between police and individuals in the midst of a psychotic episode. The pendulum of public opinion, which had swung so far towards liberty and deinstitutionalization in the 1960s, began to slowly, inexorably swing back. A new, painful debate began to take shape. It was a clash of two fundamental American ideals: the sanctity of individual freedom versus the moral responsibility of a society to care for those who cannot care for themselves. The focus shifted from tearing down the old hospitals to confronting the wreckage left in their wake. The debate was no longer about whether the old system had failed; it clearly had. The new question was terrifyingly complex. In the face of a broken brain, what does compassion truly require? And what is the price of intervention, not just in dollars but in human freedom? The battle for the soul of American mental health care was no longer being fought in the press with exposé photographs. It was moving into the courtroom. The question of compassion had become a question of constitutional rights. And the first major challenge wasn't about the right to be free, but something far more fundamental: the right to actually be treated. The landmark case began in Alabama, at a place called Bryce Hospital. The conditions were, by now, tragically familiar: thousands of patients crammed into a facility designed for a fraction of that number. Staffing was skeletal: one doctor for every 350 patients. Treatment was virtually non-existent. It was a human warehouse. But a lawsuit filed on behalf of a patient named Ricky Wyatt would change everything. The case, Wyatt versus Stickney, argued a revolutionary idea. It claimed that if the state was going to involuntarily commit someone for the purpose of treatment, then the state had a constitutional obligation to provide that treatment. To simply lock someone away without any therapeutic care was not treatment. It was imprisonment without a crime. In 1971, a federal judge named Frank M. Johnson Jr. agreed. His ruling was a thunderclap. He didn't just issue a vague order to do better. He established a set of detailed, minimum standards for care, which became known as the Wyatt Standards. These weren't suggestions. They were legally binding requirements. The standards dictated everything from the number of toilets per patient to the nutritional content of meals. They mandated that every patient must have an individualized treatment plan, reviewed regularly by a qualified professional. They set minimum staffing ratios for doctors, nurses, and therapists. They required a humane physical and psychological environment. It was the first time a court had ever defined what adequate treatment actually meant in a practical, enforceable way. The state of Alabama fought it, arguing it would be too expensive. But the court's message was clear: if you cannot afford to provide constitutional-level care, then you cannot afford to deprive citizens of their liberty. The Wyatt Standards became a blueprint, inspiring similar lawsuits across the country and forcing states to either invest massively in their institutions or begin discharging patients they couldn't legally care for. But even as the right to treatment was being established, a far more explosive legal question was making its way to the Supreme Court. It centered on a man named Kenneth Donaldson. In 1957, Donaldson, then in his late 40s, was committed to the Florida State Hospital at Chattahoochee by his own parents. They were worried about his delusions, which included a belief that he was being persecuted. Donaldson insisted he was sane. He was not a danger to himself. He was not a danger to anyone else. Yet, for the next 15 years he remained locked inside. During that time he received virtually no treatment. He was given electroshock therapy and medication against his will, but there was no psychotherapy, no individualized plan. He was just there. He repeatedly asked to be released. He had friends on the outside who offered to take him in and care for him. The hospital refused every request. One of his doctors later admitted that Donaldson was held for so long simply because he wouldn't admit he had been mentally ill in the first place. He was a prisoner of psychiatric dogma. From inside the hospital walls, Donaldson fought back. He flooded the courts with handwritten petitions. He studied law. He wrote to anyone he thought could help. For years he was ignored. But finally, his case was taken up by the American Civil Liberties Union. His lawsuit, O'Connor versus Donaldson, posed a simple, terrifying question. Can the state confine a person against their will simply because they are diagnosed with a mental illness? In 1975, the Supreme Court of the United States gave its unanimous answer. No. In a landmark decision, the court ruled that a state cannot constitutionally confine without more a non-dangerous individual who is capable of surviving safely in freedom by himself or with the help of willing and responsible family members or friends. The more was the key. You couldn't just lock someone up because their thinking was different or because society found them peculiar. There had to be something else, namely a clear and present danger to themselves or others. The Donaldson decision was the legal death knell for the old asylum system. It fundamentally shifted the balance between state power and individual liberty. It was no longer enough for a doctor to say someone was mentally ill. The state now had to prove they were dangerous. Combined with the Wyatt standards, which made institutionalization incredibly expensive, the legal and financial pressure to empty the hospitals became immense. Deinstitutionalization was no longer just a policy preference. It was becoming a legal necessity. This was hailed as a monumental victory for civil rights. And it was. The era of warehousing people for life simply for the crime of having a broken mind was over. The doors of the asylums were swinging open, and tens of thousands of people were walking back into the world, legally free for the first time in decades. But this great liberation was built on a single critical assumption: that a robust, well-funded network of community mental health centers would be there to catch them. The vision was beautiful. Instead of giant, isolated institutions, care would be local, accessible, and integrated into the community. People would live in supportive group homes, visit local clinics for therapy and medication, and receive vocational training to re-enter the workforce. It was the compassionate, modern alternative. But the vision was a mirage. The Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963 had authorized the construction of these centers, but the funding never matched the ambition. Initial federal money was meant to be temporary, with states and local governments expected to pick up the cost over time. Many never did. Then, in the early 1980s, the Reagan administration fundamentally changed the funding structure. The remaining federal money was consolidated into block grants given to the states, with fewer strings attached and often less money overall. States, facing their own budget crises, could use these funds for a variety of services, and mental health was often forced to compete with other priorities. The result was a catastrophic failure to build the promised safety net. The asylums were closing, but the community centers that were supposed to replace them were underfunded, understaffed, or in many places simply didn't exist. So as hundreds of thousands of patients were discharged, they walked out of the hospital gates and into what? For some, it was a return to a welcoming family. But for many others, whose family ties had been severed by years of institutionalization, they walked into a void. They had their freedom, but they had no support. No housing. No medication management. No therapy. No one to help them navigate a world that had moved on without them. A new grim phenomenon began to appear. The revolving door. A patient would be discharged, struggle to cope, stop taking their medication, decompensate, and end up in a crisis. They'd be brought to a hospital emergency room, stabilized over a few days, and then released right back to the same unsupported environment where the cycle would begin all over again. The system wasn't fixing the problem. It was just spinning it. The Great Liberation had produced a generation of ghosts. They were the people you saw on the street, muttering to themselves, lost in a private world. They were the ones cycling in and out of emergency rooms and homeless shelters. The goal had been to end the tragedy of the asylum. But in doing so, America had inadvertently created a new one. The problem of severe mental illness hadn't been solved. It had just been moved. And its new home would be the last place anyone ever intended, the American prison system. We had torn down the walls of the asylum in the name of freedom, but we had failed to build a foundation of care. And in that empty space, we were about to construct a new kind of institution, one with steel bars and razor wire. This wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a secret plan to trade hospital gowns for prison jumpsuits. It was a cascade of unintended consequences, a slow-motion catastrophe born from good intentions and catastrophic follow-through. The path from a state hospital ward to a county jail cell was paved, piece by piece, by policies that saw the person but not their illness. A person hearing voices on a street corner was no longer seen as a patient in need of a doctor, but a nuisance in need of a police officer. A person in the throes of a manic episode, acting erratically, was no longer a candidate for stabilization, but a suspect for disorderly conduct. The very symptoms of severe mental illness, paranoia, delusion, disorientation, became precursors to arrest. As the great hospitals emptied out, and the promised community centers failed to materialize at scale, a new infrastructure was rapidly growing in America. The 1980s and 90s saw the rise of the tough-on-crime era. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentencing, three-strikes laws. These policies cast a wide, indiscriminate net. And into that net fell hundreds of thousands of people who were, first and foremost, sick. They were self-medicating with illegal substances because they had no access to proper psychiatric care. They were committing petty survival crimes like theft or trespassing because their illness left them homeless and destitute. They weren't master criminals. They were individuals cast adrift by one broken system, only to be swallowed whole by another. The numbers tell a story so stark it's hard to comprehend. In the mid-1950s, at the peak of institutionalization, there was about one person in a public psychiatric hospital for every 300 adult Americans. By the early 2000s, there was one person in jail or prison for every 135 adult Americans. The populations had effectively inverted, and the overlap was undeniable. A landmark 2006 Bureau of Justice Statistics report revealed that more than half of all prison and jail inmates had a mental health problem. Over 70% of female inmates. The problem was, and is, particularly acute in local jails, the entry point to the system. Think about this for a moment. Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island in New York, Cook County Jail in Chicago. What do these three places have in common? They are the three largest mental health facilities in the United States. Let that sink in. Not hospitals, jails, places designed for punishment, not treatment, became the nation's de facto asylums. Correctional officers trained for security, not psychiatry, became the frontline caregivers. And the results have been exactly as disastrous as you would imagine. Imagine trying to manage a schizophrenic episode in a loud, chaotic, violent environment where everyone, guards and inmates alike, sees your symptoms as either a threat or a weakness. Imagine trying to navigate a bipolar cycle where the crushing depression is interpreted as non-compliance, and the risky, impulsive behavior of mania is met with solitary confinement. The very tools of a correctional facility are the opposite of what is needed for a therapeutic environment. A medication call is not therapy. A 15-minute check-in through a slot in a steel door is not a treatment plan. Solitary confinement, a practice now widely considered to be a form of psychological torture, became the default housing for the most disturbed individuals. It was easier to isolate the problem than to treat the person. The result? People with mental illness in prisons are more likely to be victims of violence, more likely to be punished for rule violations, and more likely to attempt suicide. They enter sick, and they often leave sicker, more traumatized, and now with a criminal record that acts as a permanent barrier to housing, employment, and stability. We had created the ultimate revolving door. A person is arrested, serves their time without receiving meaningful treatment, and is then released back onto the street, often with just a bus ticket and a few dollars. They have no medication, no therapist, no housing, no support system. It is not a question of if they will decompensate, but when. And when they do, the cycle begins again. The police are called, another arrest is made, and they are returned to the one place that has no choice but to take them, the county jail. This isn't rehabilitation. It's a cruel, expensive, and incredibly inefficient way of managing a public health crisis. We thought we were saving money by closing the state hospitals. It was a fiscal illusion. We didn't eliminate the cost, we just shifted it, and in doing so, we multiplied it. It is vastly more expensive to house a person with a serious mental illness in a jail or prison than it is to provide them with supportive housing and community-based treatment. We spend billions on emergency room visits, on police interventions, on court costs, and on the astronomical expense of incarceration. A study by the National Alliance on Mental Illness found that diverting just one person with serious mental illness from jail and into a treatment program could save communities thousands of dollars per year, per person. But we weren't just wasting money, we were wasting lives. We were taking the most vulnerable among us, stripping them of their dignity, and locking them in a system fundamentally incapable of helping them. This was the great, unspoken trade-off of deinstitutionalization. In our righteous quest to grant liberty to those locked away in asylums, we inadvertently created a system that funneled them into prisons, the ultimate denial of liberty. The asylum, for all its horrors, at least operated under the pretense of being a hospital. Its stated goal was to treat illness. The prison has no such pretense. Its purpose is to punish crime. And by criminalizing the symptoms of mental illness, we had effectively decided to punish people for being sick. We had traded one failed institution for another, one that was far more brutal, far more expensive, and far less honest about its purpose. The crisis hadn't disappeared when the hospital walls came down. It had just been hidden behind a different set of walls, tucked away from public view, where the screams were easier to ignore. The question was no longer if we had failed, but how we could possibly begin to undo a crisis of our own making. And so we stand in the wreckage of a 100-year experiment, from the asylum to the alleyway. The pendulum swung from one extreme to the other, from total institutionalization to almost total abandonment, leaving millions stranded in the middle. But to understand how we begin to undo this crisis is to understand that the answer isn't a new kind of building. It's a new kind of thinking. The future of mental health care isn't being built with brick and mortar. It's being woven into the very fabric of our communities. The first threads of this new fabric are the mobile crisis teams. Imagine this. Instead of a 911 call resulting in flashing police lights and a potential arrest, it dispatches a specialized team. A social worker, a paramedic, a peer specialist. They don't arrive with handcuffs, they arrive with compassion, de-escalation skills, and a tablet to connect someone directly with a psychiatrist. They meet people where they are, literally and figuratively, in their living rooms, under bridges, in the throes of a crisis. This isn't a fantasy. Programs like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, have been doing this for decades, diverting thousands of calls from law enforcement and saving millions of dollars. Now, cities across America are finally trying to replicate that success. It's a fundamental shift from a model of coercion to a model of connection. Then there's the quiet revolution of the peer support specialist. These are people who have walked through the fire of mental illness and addiction themselves. They have the kind of credibility that no textbook or degree can provide. They aren't just clinicians, they are guides, mentors, and living proof that recovery is possible. They sit with people in emergency rooms, help them navigate the labyrinth of social services, and offer a simple, profound message. I've been there. You are not alone, and you can get through this. This isn't just a feel-good idea. Study after study shows that integrating peers into care teams reduces hospitalizations, improves engagement, and gives people something that the old system so often stripped away: hope. The very idea of a hospital is being deconstructed and rebuilt. Instead of the massive, isolated institutions of the past, we're seeing the rise of smaller, more specialized facilities. There are crisis stabilization units, or CSUs. Think of them as an urgent care for mental health. They're places where someone can stay for a few days to get stabilized on medication, connect with a therapist, and develop a safety plan, all without the trauma and stigma of a full-blown psychiatric hospitalization. They are a crucial off-ramp before a crisis spirals into a catastrophe. We're also seeing the growth of therapeutic communities and clubhouses. These aren't hospitals at all. They're supportive environments where members, not patients, work side by side with staff to run the facility, whether it's cooking meals, publishing a newsletter, or tending a garden. It's based on a radical yet simple premise. that purpose, community, and meaningful work are themselves powerful forms of therapy. It's about rebuilding a life, not just managing a symptom. And of course, there's technology. The pandemic accelerated the adoption of telepsychiatry by a decade, breaking down geographical barriers to care. Someone in rural Montana can now see a specialist in New York City. New apps help people track their moods, practice mindfulness, and connect with therapists via text. We have the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, a simple 3-digit number designed to be as easy to remember as 911, offering an immediate connection to a trained counselor 24/7. These tools are not a panacea, but they are vital components of a new decentralized network of support. This is the new ecosystem of care, a web of interconnected services designed to catch people before they fall, rather than just reacting after they've hit the ground. It's a move from a one-size-fits-all sledgehammer to a diverse toolkit of precision instruments. It's more complex, more difficult to coordinate, but it's also infinitely more humane and effective. But let's be brutally honest. This vision is still a fragile blueprint, not a finished structure. For every city with a successful mobile crisis team, there are 100 that have nothing. For every person who finds a bed in a crisis stabilization unit, there are dozens who are turned away. The single greatest obstacle remains the same one that has plagued this story from the beginning: us. Our fear, our stigma, our unwillingness to invest. We talk a good game about mental health awareness. We post infographics on social media and tell people it's okay to not be okay. But when a new supportive housing complex or a crisis center is proposed in our own neighborhood, the "not in my backyard" signs come out. We want solutions just somewhere else, for someone else. We still, on a deep societal level, conflate mental illness with violence and unpredictability, a prejudice burned into our collective psyche by a century of horror stories, both real and imagined. And the money simply isn't there. We are trying to build a 21st century system of community care with a 20th century budget. We spend billions of dollars on the back-end consequences, on emergency room visits, on police overtime, on incarceration. A staggeringly inefficient and cruel way to manage a health crisis. Investing in proactive, community-based care isn't just the compassionate thing to do. It is the fiscally responsible thing to do. Yet, year after year, these services are the first on the chopping block. The story of America's mental hospitals is a mirror. It reflects our greatest scientific triumphs and our most profound moral failures. It shows our capacity for empathy and our tendency toward fear. We closed the asylums, believing we were liberating people from a system of cruelty. We were right about the cruelty, but we were disastrously wrong about what came next. We tore down the walls of the institution but failed to build the bridges to the community. And so we find ourselves at another turning point. The path forward isn't about finding a new, perfect institution to solve the problem for us. It's not about finding a new place to hide people away. The path forward is about finally accepting that there is no them. There is only us. These are our neighbors, our family members, our friends, ourselves. The solution lies not in a building on a hill, but in the strength of our communities, in the funding of our local services, and in the courage of our own hearts. The question is no longer just about policy or psychiatry. It's about our collective character. After a century of swinging pendulums, of well-intentioned failures and catastrophic neglect, are we finally ready to build a system based not on fear, but on dignity? A system that sees a human being in crisis not as a problem to be locked away, but as a person to be supported? The ghosts of the asylums are watching. The people in our jails and on our streets are waiting. The final chapter of this story has not yet been written. We are the ones who will write it.